Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Find a comfortable spot, perhaps with a cup of tea, because today we are going to part the velvet curtains of the past and step into a world of shimmering ballrooms and whispered secrets. The blush on a cheek was not always from modesty. Often it was the heat of sheer terror, the fear of a misstep, a clumsy word, a dance poorly executed before a judging audience. The end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 had a profound impact on the British marriage market. A flood of soldiers and sailors returned home, many of them heroes, but often with little fortune to their name. This created a new social dynamic. These officers, celebrated for their bravery and service, were now circulating in society. They had the charm, the uniform, and the romantic appeal of a hero, making them very attractive to many young women. The role of religion and the clergy in this system was complex. On one hand, the Church of England was the bedrock of society's moral framework. The local vicar or rector was a figure of authority and respectability. A clergyman was considered a stable, if not wealthy, marriage prospect. On the other hand, the church itself offered very few alternative roles for women. A woman could not be a priest or hold any position of authority. The card table was another important arena for social interaction. Games like whist, loo, and quadrille were staples of evening entertainment. The card table provided a structured way for men and women to interact, to engage in witty banter, and to size each other up. A person's playing style was seen as a reflection of their character. Were they a reckless gambler or a cautious, strategic player? Did they lose with grace or win with arrogance? The concept of masculinity in the Regency era was embodied by figures like Beau Brummel, the famous dandy. This was a new kind of man, whose status was based not on his title or wealth, but on his impeccable taste, his wit, and his sartorial elegance. Brummel and his followers championed a style of understated perfection, with exquisitely cut coats, pristine linen, and elaborately tied cravats. This focus on male fashion and grooming created a different kind of pressure for men. Let us look at the financial life of an unmarried woman of the gentry. If her father was alive, she was entirely dependent on him for her allowance, her pin money. She had no income of her own. This financial dependence was a powerful tool of control. A father could threaten to withdraw his support if a daughter showed interest in an unsuitable man. Upon her father's death, her situation could become even more precarious. The rise of the seaside resort like Brighton introduced a new, slightly more relaxed social setting. Brighton, in particular, was made fashionable by the Prince Regent, who built his extravagant royal pavilion there. The seaside offered opportunities for more informal activities, such as strolling on the promenade or taking a dip in the sea using a bathing machine for privacy. The atmosphere was less formal than London, more focused on leisure and health. The concept of connections was all important. A young woman's success on the marriage market depended heavily on the social network of her family. Having a well-connected mother or aunt who could secure invitations to the most exclusive parties and provide introductions to the most eligible men was a huge advantage. A family's connections were a form of social capital, built up over generations. The circulating libraries, which became popular during this period, were a significant feature in the lives of many women. For a subscription fee, a person could borrow the latest novels, which were often too expensive to buy outright. These libraries became social hubs in their own right, especially in towns like Bath. They were respectable public places where a woman could go, accompanied by a relative, to exchange her books. The popular entertainment of the public pleasure garden, such as Vauxhall or Ranelagh in London, offered a different kind of social experience. These were large, outdoor venues, beautifully illuminated at night, with music, food, and theatrical entertainments. They were open to a wider range of the public than a private ball, and the atmosphere was one of festivity and spectacle. However, this also made them morally ambiguous spaces. The physical ideal of female beauty during the Regency period celebrated youth and a certain delicate fragility. A pale complexion, untouched by the sun, was a sign of a lady of leisure who did not have to work outdoors. Large, expressive eyes, A small rosebud mouth and gracefully sloping shoulders were all considered desirable features, while fashion emphasized a more natural figure than in other eras. A slender and graceful physique was still prized. Women used cosmetics, but subtly. Letters sealed with wax and secrets. They were conduits of carefully constructed affection, vetted by mothers and fathers. Spontaneity was a danger. Every word was weighed, measured, and approved before it reached its recipient. Let's consider the role of humor and wit. In the novels of Jane Austen, the heroines who ultimately triumph, like Elizabeth Bennet or Emma Woodhouse, are celebrated for their intelligence and sharp wit. In reality, a woman's wit was a double-edged sword. A clever, amusing conversationalist could be very attractive, a welcome antidote to the bland politeness of most social interactions. The landscape of the English countryside, with its manicured estates and picturesque views, was not just a backdrop. It was an expression of the social order. The great country house, visible for miles around, was a symbol of the owner's power and stability. The carefully planned gardens, with their mix of formal parterres and more natural, romantic vistas, were meant to demonstrate the family's taste and wealth. For a woman, a walk through these grounds with a suitor was a tour of her potential future. The inheritance laws of the time, particularly the practice of entailment, had a massive impact on women. An entail was a legal device that restricted the inheritance of land to a specific line of heirs, almost always male. This meant that if a landowner had only daughters, his property would not pass to them. Instead, it would go to the next closest male relative, who could be a distant cousin he barely knew. This is the central problem facing the Bennet family in Pride and Prejudice. While the London season was the main event, the little season in the autumn also played a role. After spending the summer in the country, many families would return to London in September and October for a shorter, less frantic round of socializing. This was often seen as a time for more serious, targeted matchmaking. The crowds were smaller, and the atmosphere was less of a frenzy. It could be an opportunity for a courtship that had begun in the spring to be brought to a conclusion. The concept of duty was drilled into a young woman from birth. Her primary duty was to her family. This meant obeying her parents, upholding the family honor, and above all, making a marriage that would benefit the family's social and financial standing. Personal happiness, romantic love, and individual desires were all expected to be subordinated to this greater duty. To refuse a good offer of marriage that her parents approved of was seen as a selfish and ungrateful act. The role of siblings could be a source of both support and rivalry. Sisters close in age would often come out into society together, navigating the marriage market as a team. They could offer each other advice and comfort. However, it could also create a sense of competition, especially if an older sister remained unmarried while a younger sister received offers. A brother could be a valuable protector and ally. Let's consider the food and drink served at these events. At a ball, the refreshments were often light. Supper might consist of white soup, cold meats, jellies, and pastries. Champagne, a relatively new and exciting luxury, was becoming increasingly popular. The food was part of the overall display of the host's wealth and sophistication. For the attendees, however, eating and drinking were also fraught with rules. A woman had to eat daintily, never appearing too hungry. The influence of the military was everywhere in the later Regency period. Years of war with France had made military heroes into national celebrities. The red coat of an army officer or the dark blue of a naval officer became a common sight in ballrooms. This scarlet fever made these men highly attractive, but their presence disrupted the traditional marriage market. They often had heroic reputations and charm, but lacked the land and inherited wealth that was the traditional basis for a good match. The concept of privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist for an unmarried woman of the ton. Her life was a public affair, lived under the constant surveillance of her family and society. Her letters were read, her conversations were monitored, and her every public move was scrutinized. Even her private time was not her own. She was expected to be practicing her accomplishments or engaged in improving reading. The only real privacy she could hope for was in her own mind. The world of sport was almost exclusively male. Activities like hunting, shooting, and boxing were central to the life of a country gentleman. They were arenas for male bonding and the demonstration of masculine prowess. While a woman might be a skilled horsewoman, she did not participate in the hunt itself. She might at most follow the hunt at a safe distance in a carriage. This exclusion from the world of sport reinforced the separation of male and female spheres. Consider the mirror. Before every ball, a woman would gaze into it, seeing not just her reflection, but the family's hopes, the weight of her lineage, and the pressing need to perform her role flawlessly. Let's discuss the wedding journey or honeymoon. After the wedding, it was customary for the newly married couple to travel for a few weeks. This was not necessarily a romantic getaway in the modern sense. It was the first time the couple would ever be truly alone together, and it served as a period of transition into their new married life. The destination was often a tour of the country, sometimes visiting relatives who would host them and celebrate their union. The idea of a bluestocking was a pejorative term for a woman who was seen as overly intellectual or interested in academic pursuits. The bluestocking society was a real informal group of educated women in the mid-18th century, but by the Regency, the term had become a form of mockery. It was used to police the boundaries of female knowledge. A woman who flaunted her learning, who preferred discussing politics or philosophy to fashion and gossip, was labeled a bluestocking. The role of the widow was a unique and often powerful one. A widow who had been well provided for in her husband's will, with a good jointure and control over her own finances, could achieve a level of freedom and autonomy that no unmarried woman or wife could hope for. She was free from the authority of both her father and her husband. She could manage her own property, make her own social decisions, and even choose to remarry for love, not for security. The physical act of travel was difficult and often uncomfortable, which reinforced the localized nature of most people's social lives. Journeys by carriage were slow, the roads were often in poor condition, and there was a risk of being held up by highwaymen. This meant that, for most of the gentry, their social world was confined to their immediate neighborhood and the nearest market town. The annual trip to London or a resort like Bath was a major undertaking. The concept of sensibility, which had been popular in the late 18th century, was still influential. Sensibility celebrated deep, intense feeling, emotional sensitivity, and a strong connection to nature and art. A person of sensibility was supposed to be easily moved to tears of joy or sorrow. In the context of courtship, this could be a desirable trait, suggesting a romantic and feeling soul. Let's consider the influence of royal behavior. The Prince Regent, who ruled in place of his incapacitated father, King George III, set a tone of extravagance, indulgence, and moral laxity at the very top of society. His lavish spending on projects like the Brighton Pavilion and his scandalous personal life, including his disastrous marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, were the talk of the nation. The duel of words was often as dangerous as the duel of pistols. A sharp, witty retort, a cleverly phrased insult, or a cutting piece of satire could do immense damage to a person's social standing. The art of conversation was highly prized, and an evening's entertainment often revolved around verbal games and clever repartee. For a woman, participating in this required great skill. She needed to be witty enough to be noticed, but not so sharp as to give offense. The distinction between old money and new money was a source of constant social tension. Old money belonged to the landed aristocracy and gentry, families who had held their wealth and status for generations. New money belonged to the rapidly growing class of industrialists, bankers, and merchants who had made their fortunes in the booming economy. The music of the ballroom was the soundtrack to the marriage market. The orchestra, often discreetly positioned on a balcony, would play a series of country dances, cotillions, and, for the privileged few, the scandalous waltz. The choice of music and the skill of the musicians were a reflection of the host's status. Each dance had its own specific choreography, which every well-bred person was expected to know. The consumption of media, limited as it was, played a role. Newspapers of the day contained society columns that reported on the comings and goings of the ton. They would announce which families had arrived in London for the season, which major balls had been held, and most importantly, they would announce the engagements and marriages of prominent individuals. To have one's engagement announced in the Morning Post was the final, official confirmation of a successful match. The waltz was a revolution, scandalous in its intimacy. To be held in a man's arms, spinning in public view, was both a thrilling privilege and a perilous test of a lady's composure. The concept of a woman's honor was intrinsically tied to her sexual virtue, but it was also something that was defined and defended by the men in her life. Her honor was a reflection on her father and brothers. If a man insulted her or trifled with her affections, it was seen as an insult to them. This is why they held the right to challenge the offender to a duel. The woman herself had no public recourse. She could not defend her own honor in public. Let's consider the physical toll of the season. The schedule was relentless. A young woman would be out late at balls night after night, getting very little sleep. She would then have to be up for morning calls and afternoon excursions. The dresses, while appearing light, could be restrictive, and the constant need to maintain perfect posture was exhausting. Add to this the immense psychological stress of being constantly judged, the anxiety of trying to attract the right partner, and the fear of failure. The role of the elderly in this society was one of authority and judgment. Grandmothers, dowager aunts, and older matriarchs of the family were powerful figures. They were the living repositories of family history and social knowledge. Their approval of a potential match was crucial. A young woman would be presented to her suitor's elderly female relatives for inspection. These formidable women would judge her manners, her accomplishments, and her breeding. The concept of a companion was a specific role for a gentlewoman who had fallen on hard times. If a spinster had no family to support her, she might find a position as a paid companion to a wealthy older woman, often a widow. The companion was not quite a servant, but not a member of the family either. She lived in a social gray area, a life of genteel poverty and dependence. The language of flowers, or floriography, while often associated more with the Victorian era, had its roots in this period. The giving of a tussy-mussy, or small, meaningful bouquet could be a way of conveying a secret message. Different flowers were assigned different meanings. A red rose might signify passionate love, while a yellow one could mean jealousy. A suitor with a knowledge of this language could send a coded message of his feelings to a lady. The legal process for divorce during this period was so difficult and expensive that it was virtually non-existent for all but the wealthiest and most determined. It required a private act of Parliament and was a scandalous, public affair. For a woman to obtain a divorce, she had to prove not only that her husband had committed adultery, but also that he was guilty of an additional offense like bigamy or extreme cruelty. A man, however, only needed to prove his wife's adultery. The coming of age for a young man, typically at age 21, was a major event. If he was the heir to an estate, this was the moment he officially came into his inheritance and gained control of his fortune. This often precipitated his entry onto the marriage market as a highly eligible bachelor. A young man's 21st birthday could set off a flurry of activity among matchmaking mothers, who would now see him as a prime target for their daughters. The difference in age between a husband and wife was often significant. It was not uncommon for a young woman of 18 or 19 to be married to a man in his late 20s, 30s, or even older. This age gap reinforced the power imbalance in the relationship. The husband was not just a partner, he was a more experienced, worldly figure of authority. The young bride was expected to be guided and molded by him. This dynamic was considered normal and even desirable. The changing fashions in art and architecture also influenced social life. The Regency period saw a fascination with classicism and the picturesque. This taste for order, harmony, and romantic scenery was reflected in the design of homes and gardens. An appreciation for these aesthetic trends was considered a mark of good taste and sophistication. A suitor might try to impress a lady by discussing the architectural merits of a building, or by pointing out a picturesque view on a country walk. Let's examine the role of children in this world. Children were, in many ways, the ultimate goal of the marriage contract, particularly the production of a son and heir. However, in upper-class families, parents were often quite distant from their young children. Babies and toddlers were cared for almost exclusively by a staff of nurses and nursery maids. As they grew older, they would be turned over to governesses and tutors. Parents might see their children for a short, formal period each day. Almack's Assembly Rooms, the most exclusive club in London. Gaining entry required the approval of its stern patronesses. To be denied, a voucher was to be cast out from the highest tier of the marriage market. The mail coach system, which was greatly improved during this period, was the lifeline of long-distance communication. It allowed for the relatively swift and reliable delivery of letters, connecting people across the country. For a young woman whose family was in the country, letters from friends or relatives in London were a vital source of news and gossip about the season. For a couple in the midst of a formal courtship, the arrival of the mail coach with a letter from a suitor was a significant event. The church pew was another place where social hierarchy was on full display. A family's social standing was reflected in the location and size of their pew in the local parish church. The most prominent family, often the local squire or lord of the manor, would have the largest and most prominent pew, usually at the front. Other families of the gentry would be seated according to their relative rank. The custom of wearing mourning clothes was governed by a strict and complex etiquette. The length of the mourning period and the type of fabric worn depended on one's relationship to the deceased. For a widow, the period of deep mourning, wearing stark black crepe, could last for a year or more. During this time, she was expected to withdraw completely from society. She could not attend balls, parties, or the theater. This enforced seclusion had a major impact on the marriage market. The role of the university was exclusively male. Oxford and Cambridge were the training grounds for the sons of the elite, preparing them for careers in the church, law, or politics. A university education was a key part of a young man's resume, a sign of his breeding and intellectual preparation. Women were completely excluded from this world of higher education. Their education was a domestic and social one, focused on the accomplishments. The city of London itself was a city of stark contrasts. The elegant squares and terraces of Mayfair and St. James's, where the ton lived, were a world away from the crowded, unsanitary slums of the East End. For a wealthy young woman, London meant this small, protected bubble of the West End. She would have very little conception of how the vast majority of the city's population lived. Her world was one of carriages, drawing rooms, and parks. The army provided one of the few avenues for a man without inherited wealth to achieve social advancement. A man who distinguished himself through bravery in battle could rise through the ranks and gain a respectable position. However, an officer's pay was often meager, and life in the army, especially during peacetime, could be a tedious round of provincial postings. This is the situation of Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice. Let's consider the concept of character. In the novels of the period, a great deal of emphasis is placed on judging a person's true character, which may be hidden behind a charming or fashionable exterior. A woman was constantly being advised to look beyond the superficial attractions of a suitor and to assess his underlying moral character. Was he honorable? Was he kind? Was he prudent with money? The landscape of the mind was also shaped by the popular literary genres of the time. The Gothic novel, with its haunted castles, mysterious villains, and damsels in distress, was wildly popular. These books, like Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, offered readers a thrilling escape into a world of heightened emotion and suspense. For young women living highly restricted lives, these novels provided a powerful, imaginative outlet. The dowry system had a profound impact on family dynamics. In a family with many daughters, the need to provide a respectable dowry for each one could place an enormous financial strain on the father. This could lead to daughters being pitted against each other, or a father favoring the prettiest daughter whom he thought had the best chance of making a good match. It also meant that a woman's marriage was not just her own affair. but a major financial event for the entire family. The concept of retirement from society was an important one. Once a woman was married, her role on the primary stage of the marriage market was over. If she was the wife of a country squire, she would likely retire to his estate, leaving the London scene behind for a life focused on managing her household and raising her children. She might return to London for brief periods, but she was no longer a central player in the game. A woman could not simply choose her partner. She had to be chosen. Her role was one of passive elegance, of waiting to be noticed, of hoping the right gentleman would request an introduction from the right host. The simple act of walking was governed by etiquette. A young, unmarried woman would never walk alone in London. She would always be accompanied by a chaperone, a servant, or a male relative. On a country walk, if she was with a gentleman, she might be permitted to take his arm. This was a significant gesture, a public signal of a degree of intimacy and encouragement. To walk with the same man frequently was a clear sign of a developing courtship. Even the pace and manner of walking were judged. Let's focus on the governess, a figure who embodies the precarious position of the educated but impoverished gentlewoman. The governess was a staple of many upper-class households, responsible for educating the young daughters of the family. She was a woman of good breeding and education, but without fortune. This placed her in a deeply uncomfortable social limbo. She was not a servant, so she did not eat with them. The second season carried a particular kind of pressure. A debutante who failed to secure a proposal in her first London season would return the following year carrying a subtle stigma. She was no longer the fresh, new face. She was now a known quantity who had been, for whatever reason, passed over. Matchmaking mothers might wonder what was wrong with her. Was her dowry too small? Was there a rumor of scandal? Was her temperament difficult? The concept of pin money is a fascinating window into female economic reality. This was a specific, personal allowance, usually secured in the marriage settlement, that was intended for the wife's sole use for clothing, personal adornments, and charity. It was one of the very few sums of money a married woman could control directly. The amount of pin money was a point of negotiation in the marriage settlement and a status symbol. Let's explore the role of the circulating library from a different angle, as a venue for discreet flirtation. In a town like Bath or a seaside resort, the library was one of the few respectable public places where a young woman could go. While there, under the watchful eye of a chaperone, a gentleman could also happen to be present. An encounter could be engineered over a book. A man could recommend a novel, or they could discuss a popular poem. The code of conduct at a dinner party was incredibly elaborate. The seating plan was a matter of intense strategic importance for the hostess, with guests arranged according to a strict hierarchy of rank and social standing. The highest-ranking female guest would be seated to the right of the host. A young, unmarried woman would be placed far down the table. A gentleman was expected to direct his conversation primarily to the lady seated to his right. The world of domestic crafts, or fancy work, was the prescribed pastime for a gentlewoman. A woman was expected to be skilled in needlepoint, embroidery, and perhaps netting purses or painting on velvet. These activities were intended to keep her hands busy and demonstrate her domestic virtues and patience. Her finished products could be used to decorate the home or be given as gifts. Often, a group of women would sit together in the drawing room, working on their crafts while they conversed. The idea of a rake or a libertine is a common trope in Regency romance, but it reflects a real social type. A rake was a man, usually an aristocrat who was known for his dissolute lifestyle. He was a gambler, a heavy drinker, and a seducer of women. In fiction, these men are often portrayed as irresistibly charming and are ultimately reformed by the love of a good woman. In reality, marrying a rake was an exceptionally dangerous proposition. The role of the family lawyer was crucial, though he operated behind the scenes. Before any engagement could be finalized, the lawyers for both families would get involved. They were the ones who hammered out the fine print of the marriage settlement. They investigated the groom's finances, uncovering any hidden debts or encumbrances on his estate. They fought to secure the best possible terms for the bride's dowry, pin money, and jointure. These men were the unsentimental realists in the process. The morning visit or morning call was a cornerstone of social life. It's important to note that morning in the Regency sense meant any time from about 11 a.m. to 3 or 4 p.m. These were not casual drop-ins. A visitor would present their calling card to a servant, who would take it to the mistress of the house. She could then decide whether to receive them or to declare herself not at home, a polite fiction to avoid an unwanted guest. The morning call, a ritual of excruciating formality. A gentleman would visit, staying for no more than 20 minutes, the conversation stilted and public, every syllable monitored by the chaperone. The role of a patron was vital for a man trying to make his way in the world. A young man starting a career in the army, the church, or politics needed a powerful, well-connected older man to take an interest in him and help him advance. This system of patronage was how much of the country was run. For a woman considering a suitor, his connections and his patron were as important as his immediate income. A young clergyman with a powerful patron might be on track for a lucrative parish. Let's explore the physical space of a lady's dressing room. This was one of the few truly private female spaces in the house. It was a room adjacent to her bedroom where she would dress, have her hair done by her maid, and write her letters. It was her personal sanctuary, off limits to most male visitors. This was where she could drop the public mask. Here, she could confide in her maid, read a forbidden novel, or cry over a disappointment without fear of being observed. The use of cosmetics was a delicate matter. While a pale complexion was prized, an obviously painted face was associated with courtesans and actresses, not respectable ladies. Therefore, any cosmetic use had to be subtle and natural-looking. Women used preparations to whiten their skin, such as lotions made from lead or mercury, which were, of course, highly toxic. A touch of carmine or rouge could be used to add a healthy blush to the cheeks and lips. The concept of propriety was the guiding star of a woman's conduct. It was an all-encompassing code of what was considered socially acceptable behavior, speech, and even thought. Propriety dictated that a woman should be modest, demure, and self-effacing. She should never draw undue attention to herself, express strong emotions in public, or engage in loud or boisterous behavior. She was to be the serene, graceful ornament of the drawing room. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to transform the landscape of Britain, but its impact on the ton was indirect yet profound. The source of the new money that was flooding into the marriage market came from the mills, mines, and factories of the industrial North. This created a cultural clash. The landed aristocracy, whose wealth was based on agriculture and inheritance, often looked down on the vulgar, industrialists whose wealth was earned through trade and manufacturing. The country dance was more than just a dance. It was a social metaphor. In a long way set, couples would progress up and down the line, dancing with each new couple they met. This meant that over the course of the dance, a person could interact with many different partners of varying social rank. However, one's initial starting position in the set was determined by rank, with the most important people at the top. Let's consider the emotional impact of a broken engagement. While a man could be sued for breach of promise, the real damage to a woman was social and emotional. A broken engagement was a public humiliation. It suggested that the man had either found something wrong with her or her family, or that he was dishonorable. Society would gossip, wondering what the reason was. The woman would be pitied, and her value on the marriage market would be diminished. She was now damaged goods. The concept of elegance was a key virtue for a woman. It was a combination of graceful movement, refined taste in dress, and a composed and polished manner. Elegance was not just about being beautiful. It was about projecting an air of effortless perfection. It was something that was cultivated through years of training in posture, dance, and deportment. A woman's elegance was a sign of her good breeding and her suitability for a high-status marriage. The role of the village or town assembly was the provincial equivalent of almacs. In a country town, the local gentry would hold regular assembly balls in a public hall. This was the main social event for the neighborhood, the primary stage for local courtships. The rules were just as strict as in London, but the pool of potential partners was much smaller. This intensified the rivalries and the gossip. The idea of home was deeply entwined with a woman's life journey. As an unmarried daughter, her home was her father's house, but her position in it was temporary. She was waiting to be transplanted. Her ultimate goal was to become the mistress of her own home, which would be her husband's house. The transition from one to the other was the central event of her life. The management of the household, or domestic economy, was considered a woman's primary sphere of influence. Ruin. It was a simple word for a complex social death. To be ruined was to become a ghost, invisible to the society that had once judged you, a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms. The changing political climate of the Regency era, with its debates about reform, revolution, and the rights of man, had a subtle but important impact on women. While women were excluded from the political process, they were not immune to the ideas that were in the air. The writings of Mary Wollstonecraft and other early feminists were read and debated, at least in some circles. The idea that women were rational beings who deserved education and a degree of autonomy was beginning to take root. The coming-out ball was the family's biggest social investment in a daughter. This was a lavish and expensive party hosted by her parents to officially launch her into society. No expense was spared in demonstrating the family's wealth and status. The best musicians were hired, the house was filled with flowers, and a sumptuous supper was served. The guest list was carefully curated to include the most eligible bachelors and the most influential social figures. The concept of sensible was the highest praise for a match. A sensible marriage was one that was based on practical considerations, compatible social standing, a secure fortune, and a respectable character. It was a marriage that made sense on paper. This was the kind of match that parents and guardians sought for their children. It promised stability, security, and the preservation of the social order. The physical confinement of women's lives is striking. A respectable woman's world was largely confined to the domestic sphere, the drawing room, the garden, the carriage. Her public appearances were limited to a proscribed set of socially approved venues like the ballroom, the park, or the theater. She could not simply go for a walk by herself or drop into a coffee house. This physical restriction was a way of protecting her reputation and her person, but it was also a form of imprisonment. The role of debt was a constant, dark undercurrent in the lives of the aristocracy. The lavish lifestyle of the ton, the London houses, the country estates, the clothes, the parties, the gambling, was incredibly expensive. Many noble families were living far beyond their means, their estates heavily mortgaged, and their income spoken for years in advance. This made the pursuit of an heiress a matter of desperate necessity for many men. Let's consider the soundscape of a Regency ball. It was not a quiet affair. Beneath the music of the orchestra, there was the constant buzz of conversation, the rustle of silk and muslin dresses, the snap of fans, and the rhythmic tap of dancing shoes on the polished floor. It was a symphony of social interaction. The concept of character reference was not just for servants. Before a man's proposal was formally accepted, a woman's father or brother would often make discreet inquiries about him. They would speak to his friends, his commanding officer if he was in the army, or his colleagues. They were trying to build a picture of his character and habits. Was he known to be a heavy gambler? Did he drink to excess? What was his reputation with women? The weather vane of social approval was the hostess. A powerful society hostess, by extending or withholding an invitation, could literally shape a young woman's destiny. To be invited to the most exclusive balls and parties was essential for a successful season. These hostesses, often aristocratic women of great influence and experience like the patronesses of Almack's, were the gatekeepers. They curated their guest lists to create the perfect environment for matchmaking among the elite. The dowry chest, or hope chest, was a tangible symbol of a young woman's preparation for marriage. From a young age, she and her mother would begin to accumulate the items she would need to run her own household. This would include fine linens for the bed and table, often intricately embroidered with her initials, as well as her personal trousseau of clothing. The accumulation of these goods was a long-term project, a physical manifestation of the family's hopes and plans for her future. The Navy offered another path for a second son. A career as a naval officer, like that of Captain Wentworth in Persuasion, could be a route to fame and fortune, especially during the Napoleonic Wars. A successful captain could earn a great deal of prize money from capturing enemy ships. However, it was a hard and dangerous life. When the wars ended, many officers found themselves beached, left on half pay with poor prospects. A first name was a forbidden currency. A woman was Miss Austen. A man was Mr. Darcy. The use of a Christian name before a formal engagement was a shocking breach of decorum, a sign of unforgivable forwardness. The idea of a woman's sphere was a powerful organizing principle of society. This ideology held that men and women were fundamentally different and were suited to different roles. The man's sphere was the public world of politics, commerce, and war. The woman's sphere was the private world of the home, the family, and morality. The portrait miniature was a popular form of love token. This was a small, intimate portrait of a loved one, often painted in watercolor on ivory, and designed to be held in the hand or worn in a locket. Because of their personal nature, the exchange of miniatures was generally reserved for engaged couples or close family members. For a gentleman to ask a lady for her miniature was a clear and serious declaration of his intentions. For her to grant it was a sign of her acceptance. The concept of face, or saving face, was incredibly important. All of the social rituals were designed to avoid public embarrassment and to allow people to retreat from difficult situations without losing face. The polite fiction of being not at home allowed a person to avoid an unwanted visitor without giving a direct rebuff. The formal, indirect language of proposals and rejections was designed to soften the blow and allow both parties to maintain their dignity. The presence of French immigrés in London during and after the French Revolution added another layer to society. Many French aristocrats had fled the Terror and settled in London, often in a state of genteel poverty. They brought with them their own refined manners and culture, and French was the lingua franca of the European elite. A knowledge of French was a key accomplishment for any English lady. The relationship between a lady and her lady's maid was one of the most intimate in the household. The maid saw her mistress without her public mask on. She knew about her mistress's romantic hopes and fears, her health, her insecurities. She was a confidant, a stylist, and a keeper of secrets. A loyal and discreet maid was an invaluable ally. She could pass secret messages, help conceal a forbidden letter, and offer a sympathetic ear. The culture of letter writing created a different sense of time and intimacy. In the absence of instant communication, a letter was a significant event. It was something to be anticipated, read and reread and savored. The writer had time to carefully compose their thoughts, and the reader had time to reflect on the words. This created a form of intimacy that was slow, deliberate, and intellectual. The idea of class was far more complex than just a division between rich and poor. Within the upper echelons of society, there was a finely graded hierarchy. The royal family was at the top, followed by the peerage, dukes, marquises, earls, etc., then the baronetage and the knightage. Below them came the landed gentry, families who owned land but had no title. Each of these ranks had its own level of prestige. The London season was mirrored by a Bath season, or a York season, as other major towns also had their own social calendars that attracted the local gentry. While the stakes were not as high as in London, the rules were much the same. These provincial seasons were crucial for the daughters of the local clergy, lawyers, and country squires who did not have the wealth or connections to participate in the London market. The legal doctrine of coverture is worth re-emphasizing because it is the legal foundation of a woman's powerlessness. When a woman married, her legal identity was subsumed into that of her husband. She was a femme covert, a covered woman. This meant she could not own property, sign contracts, or earn her own wages. Everything she was and everything she had belonged to her husband. This is why the marriage settlement, negotiated by her father before the wedding, was so vitally important. Let us look at the men who chose not to marry. The bachelor was a common figure in society. He might be a second son without the fortune to support a family, a man dedicated to his career, or simply someone who enjoyed his freedom. While a spinster was seen as a failure, a bachelor was often seen as a romantic, elusive figure. He could enjoy the social life of the ton without the responsibilities of a wife and children. The pressure was immense. A young lady had perhaps 2 or 3 seasons to secure a husband. With each passing year, her value on the market diminished, the anxiety mounting with every failed prospect. The concept of home education for girls was paramount. While boys were sent away to public schools like Eton and Harrow, girls were educated at home, almost exclusively by a governess. Their curriculum was focused on the accomplishments: French, music, drawing, and deportment. They learned just enough history and literature to be able to hold a polite conversation, but they were not given a rigorous academic training. The rise of evangelicalism within the Church of England during this period brought a new emphasis on morality, duty, and social reform. Figures like William Wilberforce, who campaigned against the slave trade, also promoted a vision of a more sober and virtuous society. This movement was often critical of the decadent and frivolous lifestyle of the ton. The act of blushing was interpreted in multiple ways. On one hand, a blush was seen as a sign of modesty and innocence, a desirable trait in a young woman. It suggested that she was sensitive and easily affected by a compliment or a slightly risque remark. On the other hand, a frequent blusher might be seen as overly sensitive or even a sign of a guilty conscience. A woman was expected to maintain her composure or countenance at all times. To blush at the wrong moment could be a social misstep. The subscription list was another interesting social mechanism. When a person wanted to publish a book or hold a series of concerts, they would often gather subscriptions in advance to cover the costs. The list of subscribers would then be printed in the final book or program. Getting one's name on a fashionable subscription list was a way to display one's taste and culture. The tradition of the wedding tour was the forerunner of the modern honeymoon. After the wedding, the couple would embark on a series of visits to the homes of their friends and relatives. This was a way of formally presenting the new bride to the wider family circle and of celebrating the union. It was a highly social and public affair, not a private getaway. For the bride, it was an exhausting round of introductions and being on display as the new wife. The role of the village shop or the London haberdashery was a rare, semi-public space where women could exercise a degree of consumer choice. Accompanied by a chaperone, a woman could visit a shop to purchase fabric, ribbons, or other small items. These outings were a limited form of freedom. The act of shopping allowed a woman to engage with the world of commerce, to handle money, or more likely, to have things charged to her father's or husband's account, and to make aesthetic choices. The fear of scandal was the great policing mechanism of the age. The ton was a small, insular world and news traveled with incredible speed. A single misstep, being seen in the wrong place with the wrong person at the wrong time, could be magnified by gossip into a full-blown scandal. A scandal could destroy a woman's marriage prospects overnight. It could lead to a family being ostracized, their invitations drying up, their social world collapsing. The novels of Sir Walter Scott, which became immensely popular during this period, created a new romantic fascination with the past, particularly with the chivalry and honor of the medieval and Tudor eras. This historicism influenced fashion, architecture, and even social ideals. It promoted a romanticized image of knighthood and courtly love, where men were valiant protectors and women were pure, idealized objects of devotion. The financial panic that could be caused by the failure of a bank was a real and present danger. In an era before government deposit insurance, the collapse of a bank could wipe out a family's entire fortune overnight. This financial instability added another layer of anxiety to the marriage market. A man who appeared to be wealthy one day could be destitute the next. This is why landed property was considered so much more secure and desirable than wealth derived from commerce or finance. Let's consider the concept of the dandy, exemplified by Beau Brummel. The dandy's influence was enormous. He championed a new form of masculinity based on refined taste, understated elegance, and supreme self-control. His style, the perfectly starched cravat, the impeccably tailored dark coat, the polished boots, became the uniform of the fashionable man. For a woman, a man's ability to emulate this style was a sign that he was part of the inner circle of the ton. Imagine a world painted in watercolor hues, of grand estates and elegant carriages. A world where every glance held a hidden meaning, and every dance was a negotiation for one's entire future. The carriage ride, a rare moment of semi-privacy. Yet even here, through the glass, the eyes of the world were watching, judging the pairing, speculating on the seriousness of the courtship. The coming of age for a young woman was not marked by a specific birthday, but by her coming out into society. This could happen any time from the age of 16 to 18, depending on her family's decision. This transition from the schoolroom to the ballroom was abrupt and transformative. One day she was a child, confined to the nursery and supervised by her governess. The circulating library was more than a book rental service. It was a cultural battleground. Many moralists of the day saw the novel, particularly the romantic or Gothic novel, as a corrupting influence, especially on young women. They feared it would inflame the passions, encourage unrealistic expectations of love, and make women dissatisfied with their prescribed roles. Sermons were preached, and pamphlets were written against the evils of novel reading. The physical ideal for men in this period was also specific. The dandy aesthetic favored a slender, athletic build that could be shown off by the tightly fitting coats and breeches of the era. A man's skill in horsemanship, fencing, and dancing were all part of his physical presentation. This was a departure from the more robust, portly ideal of the earlier Georgian era. This new emphasis on fitness and elegance in men created a parallel set of physical pressures. The importance of precedence in social situations was absolute. Precedence was the formal system that determined social rank, based on a complex combination of title, office, and seniority. At any social gathering, the order in which guests entered a room, were seated at dinner, or proceeded on a walk was dictated by the strict rules of precedence. A hostess had to have an encyclopedic knowledge of these rules to avoid giving grave offense. The role of the poor relation was a common and uncomfortable one. This was a relative, often a spinster aunt or a widowed cousin, who lacked independent means and was forced to live on the charity of a wealthier branch of the family. They were in a position of perpetual dependence, expected to be grateful and to make themselves useful by helping with the children or sewing. They were often treated with a mixture of pity and condescension. The landscape of memory was different. Without photography, a person's image was preserved only in a painted portrait or a miniature. The memory of a loved one's face was a precious and fragile thing. The exchange of a lock of hair was another common and deeply personal love token. These physical mementos took on an enormous emotional significance. They were the tangible anchors of affection and memory in a world without mechanical reproduction. The influence of classical antiquity was everywhere in the Regency, a trend known as neoclassicism. It was visible in the architecture with its columns and pediments, in the fashion with the high-waisted gowns that mimicked Greek statuary, and in furniture design. An education for a man was steeped in the Greek and Roman classics. For a woman, an appreciation of this classical aesthetic was a mark of her good taste. The role of the confidant is a staple of the literature of the period, and it reflects a real social need. In a world of such intense public scrutiny, a young woman desperately needed a trusted friend, usually a sister or a cousin, in whom she could confide her true feelings. This confidant was her ally, her advisor, and her emotional support system. Let's discuss the concept of interest in a suitor. When a gentleman was said to show interest in a lady, it was a very specific and loaded term. It meant he was moving beyond general politeness and beginning a deliberate public courtship. His interest would be demonstrated by a series of observable actions: dancing with her twice, calling on her frequently, escorting her in the park. The parish church was not just a place of worship, it was the center of the community's record-keeping. The parish register was where all births, marriages, and deaths were officially recorded. This made the church a key institution in verifying a person's age, legitimacy, and social connections. Before a marriage could take place, the banns had to be read in the home parishes of both the bride and groom for 3 consecutive Sundays. Love was a luxury, a happy accident. The primary goal was a suitable match, one that would secure financial stability, social standing, and the continuation of a family line. Romance was secondary. The season was not just about balls. It also included a range of cultural activities that were part of the social round. A visit to the Royal Academy's annual art exhibition was a fashionable outing. Attending public lectures, particularly on scientific topics which were becoming popular, was another. These events were opportunities for a woman to display her accomplishments and her refined taste. They also provided a venue for courtship that was more intellectual than a ballroom. The financial instrument of the annuity was a common way of providing for women. An annuity was a fixed sum of money paid to someone each year for the rest of their life. A father's will might leave his daughters annuities rather than a lump sum of capital. The jointure secured for a widow in a marriage settlement was also a form of annuity. While an annuity provided a secure income, it also meant the woman had no capital to pass on to her own children. The concept of a good family was about more than just title or wealth. It also referred to a family's reputation. A good family was one that was known for its honor, its integrity, and the respectable conduct of its members. It was a family free from any major scandal. When considering a match, a family would look not just at the suitor himself, but at his entire family. Was his mother a respectable woman? Were his sisters well behaved? Was his father a man of his word? The role of a mentor was important for a young woman entering society. This was often an older, experienced, and well-connected married woman, perhaps an aunt or a family friend. She would take the debutante under her wing, guiding her through the complexities of the season. She would advise her on who to dance with, who to avoid, how to dress, and how to behave. She could provide crucial introductions and use her influence to promote her charge's interests. The tradition of the honeymoon as a private, romantic trip for the couple alone is largely a Victorian invention. In the Regency era, the wedding tour, or bridal tour, was a much more public affair. The newly married couple would travel, often for several weeks, visiting the homes of various relatives and important friends. The purpose was to introduce the new wife to her husband's social circle and to receive the congratulations of the community. It was a final, extended round of social duties. The card game of whist was immensely popular and reveals much about the social values of the time. It is a game of skill, strategy, and partnership. Unlike games of pure chance, whist required intelligence, memory, and the ability to communicate silently with one's partner through the cards one played. To be a good whist player was a sign of a good mind. It was a respectable and intellectual pastime, and the card table was a key site of social interaction. The boarding school for girls existed, but it was often seen as a second-best option to a home education with a governess. Sending a daughter away to school was sometimes a sign that the family could not afford a private governess, or that the mother was not able to supervise her education. These schools focused on teaching the same accomplishments as a governess would. The fear of a French-style revolution was a very real undercurrent in British politics and society. The memory of the Bloody Terror was fresh, and the ruling class was deeply anxious about any sign of popular unrest. This fear led to a political crackdown on radicalism and a strong emphasis on social stability and tradition. This conservative climate reinforced the rigid social hierarchy and the traditional roles of men and women. The physical act of dancing itself was a form of communication. The way a man held a woman, the confidence of his lead, the grace of his movements, all sent a message. For a woman, her ability to follow his lead gracefully, her posture, and her light step were all judged as part of her overall performance. The country dance, with its moments of brief, smiling contact with a partner, was a form of public flirtation. The waltz, with its shocking intimacy, was a statement of serious intent. The idea of female friendship was celebrated, but it was also seen as secondary to the primary goal of marriage. Friendships between women were supposed to be a source of comfort and moral support. However, they could also be fraught with rivalry, especially when two friends were competing for the attention of the same man. The ultimate loyalty of a woman was expected to be to her family and eventually to her husband. A gentleman could be a rake, a gambler, a drunkard, and his reputation might be enhanced by a roguish charm. A woman who made a single mistake was tainted forever, with no hope of redemption. The curtsy was a fundamental part of a woman's physical vocabulary. From a young age, she was taught to curtsy correctly. It was a gesture of respect shown to social superiors. The depth of the curtsy would vary depending on the rank of the person being greeted. The most elaborate was the formal court curtsy performed when being presented to the monarch. This simple, deferential gesture was a constant physical reinforcement of the social hierarchy and of a woman's subordinate place within it. The tattler and the spectator, though from an earlier period, had established a tradition of social commentary and satire that continued into the Regency. The witty, observant essayist who commented on the follies and fashions of the age was a key cultural figure. This tradition of satire created a society that was highly self-aware and constantly observing itself. The members of the ton knew they were characters in a play, and they were all aware of the critics in the audience. Let us return to the word nightmare. It is a strong word, but for many, it was an apt one. Imagine the constant, unrelenting pressure, the knowledge that your entire future, your economic survival, your social standing, and your personal happiness all rested on a successful performance over a few short months. Imagine the terror of a misstep, the fear of being left on the shelf, the suffocation of being constantly watched and judged. And yet, it is a mistake to see these women only as victims. They were participants in this system, and many learned to play the game with extraordinary skill and intelligence. They wielded the limited power they had, their beauty, their wit, their accomplishments, with strategic precision. They formed alliances, managed their reputations, and used the subtle language of fans and flowers to communicate their desires. The legacy of these brutal rules is long and complex. The Regency era, with its emphasis on propriety and female purity, laid the foundation for the even more rigid morality of the Victorian age. The idea of separate spheres for men and women, the double standard, and the view of marriage as a woman's ultimate career would dominate Western culture for another century. Even today, echoes of this world remain. So, as we draw the curtains on the Regency ballroom, let us remember it not just as a place of elegance and romance, but as a complex and often brutal social arena. It was a world of profound contradictions, of public propriety and private vice, of stifling restriction and subtle rebellion, of cold transaction and the enduring hope of love. The women of this era were not simple characters from a novel. They were real people navigating a system of almost impossible expectations. The intricate dance of the drawing room, who to speak to, who to avoid. A conversation with the wrong person could signal a lack of judgment. It was a social chessboard where one wrong move meant checkmate. The pianoforte, a necessary accomplishment. A young woman played not just for pleasure, but for display. Her musical skill was part of her portfolio, another asset to be presented to potential suitors and their critical mothers. A dropped handkerchief, a seemingly innocent accident. But in this world of coded gestures, it could be an invitation, a subtle signal of interest in a room where direct communication was impossible. The country house party, a week-long interview disguised as a vacation. Here, away from the city, a suitor could observe a lady's character, her temperament, her suitability for the role of a wife. Behind the gilded facades and polite smiles, there was a quiet desperation. The fear of being left on the shelf, of becoming a spinster, a burden to one's family, a figure of pity. The marriage proposal itself was rarely a surprise. It came only after a series of negotiations between families, after the lawyers had inspected the finances and the settlements had been drafted. The silence in a ballroom could be deafening. The moment when the music stops and a young woman finds herself without a partner for the next dance, standing alone under the weight of 100 gazes. Here, a lady's reputation was her most valuable currency, more precious than gold or jewels. It was a fragile, crystalline thing that, once shattered, could never be pieced back together again. A compliment from a gentleman was a delicate thing. Too bold, and it was an insult to a lady's honor. Too subtle, and it went unnoticed. It had to be perfectly calibrated, a respectful appreciation of her grace. The choice of a dress was a strategic decision. White symbolized purity and youth, making it the uniform of the debutante. The color and cut of a gown could signal availability, status, and taste. Whispers were weapons. Gossip, spread with ruthless efficiency in hushed tones behind fans and in private withdrawing rooms, could build a reputation or, more often, tear one down with devastating speed. Riding in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour. This was not exercise. It was a parade. A lady had to demonstrate her equestrian skill, her fine horse, and her ability to converse charmingly while in motion. A man could refuse a dance without consequence. A woman who refused a dance from a suitable partner risked causing a grave insult, not just to him, but to the host who had introduced them. The accomplished woman was a concept both celebrated and feared. She had to be skilled in music, art, and languages, but never so skilled that she might intimidate or outshine a potential husband. To express a strong opinion, especially on politics or finance, was considered unwomanly. A lady's mind was to be a pleasant garden, not a rigorous forum for debate. Her intelligence was best served by being a good listener. The moment of an introduction was critical. It was the formal granting of permission to speak. Without it, a gentleman could not approach a lady, and she was obliged to ignore his very existence. The pressure came not just from society, but from within the family. A mother, having successfully navigated the market herself, would drill her daughter relentlessly, her own social standing tied to her child's success. Courtship was a public performance from start to finish. Private feelings were irrelevant. What mattered was the perception of a perfect match, the public approval of the union by the powerful tastemakers of the ton. The London season was not a holiday. It was a campaign, a battlefield disguised with silk and champagne, where young women were presented not as debutantes, but as precious commodities on the marriage market. A book held in a lady's hand could be a signal. A volume of poetry might suggest a romantic soul, while a serious history could be a warning that she was not to be trifled with. The dowry was not a gift, it was a payment. It was the price a father paid to a future husband to take on the financial burden of his daughter for the rest of her life. The wrong sort of man, a soldier with no fortune, a poet with no prospects. An attraction to such a man was a dangerous indulgence, a path that could lead only to heartbreak and social ostracism. Sickness, whether real or feigned, was a common excuse to escape a dreaded social event. A headache could be a shield against the pressures of a ball where no desirable partners were expected. The wedding ring was not just a symbol of love. It was a symbol of victory, of a successful campaign. It represented social security, a defined role, and an escape from the brutal marketplace of courtship. Flirting was an art form, but a perilous one. A woman had to be engaging without being forward, charming without being intimate. She walked a tightrope, where one misstep meant a fall from grace. The city of Bath offered a different market, a place for those of lesser fortunes or those in need of a second chance. But even here, the rules were just as rigid, the judgment just as swift. A young woman's dance with an older, married man was often a favor to the host. It was a safe, respectable pairing that kept her on the dance floor invisible, but it did not advance her prospects. Tears were a private indulgence. In public, a woman was expected to maintain a mask of serene contentment, no matter the anxieties or disappointments she faced. Emotional vulnerability was a weakness she could not afford. A simple walk in the gardens could be a minefield. Taking a man's arm was a sign of encouragement. 2 turns around the garden with the same man was practically a declaration of impending engagement. See the dance card, not as a simple list of partners, but as a ledger of a woman's social standing. Each name inscribed was a measure of her success, each blank space a whisper of her failure. And so the performance continued, night after night. A relentless play where the actresses were amateurs, the critics were everyone, and the prize was not applause, but survival in a world with no safety net. We begin our story not in the glittering ballroom, but in the cold reality of the counting house, for this is where the brutal truth of the Regency marriage market is laid bare. The most shocking rule of all was that a woman's entire existence was, first and foremost, a financial transaction. Before any courtship could begin, the fathers or their lawyers would meet. They would not discuss the compatibility of their children, their shared interests, or their hopes for happiness. Instead, they would discuss numbers. This process gave rise to the single most terrifying word in a young woman's vocabulary: ruin. Today, the word feels archaic, melodramatic, but in the Regency era, it was a sentence of social death. What constituted ruin? It was a shockingly broad and unforgiving category. Being alone with a man who was not a relative without a chaperone present. Receiving a letter from a man directly without it passing through her parents' hands. Allowing a man to use her first name in public. The stage for this high-stakes drama was the London season. This was a specific period of the year, roughly from late January until early July, when Parliament was in session, and the wealthy elite, known as the ton, flocked to the city. For a young debutante, this was her moment of presentation to the world. Her family would rent a house in a fashionable district like Mayfair, and she would embark on a grueling schedule of social events. At the apex of the social pyramid stood Almack's Assembly Rooms. It was not the most opulent or beautiful venue in London, but it was, without question, the most exclusive. To receive a voucher for entry was to be certified as belonging to the absolute highest echelon of society. The club was run by a committee of powerful, aristocratic women known as the Lady Patronesses. These women, including figures like Lady Jersey and Princess Esterhazy, were the ultimate gatekeepers. The rules of engagement within these ballrooms were incredibly rigid and designed to prevent any form of impropriety. A woman could not simply approach a man she found interesting. She had to wait to be formally introduced by a mutual acquaintance, often the host or hostess of the ball. Once introduced, a man might request the honor of a dance. A lady was generally expected to accept, unless the man was of a significantly lower social standing, drunk, or otherwise unsuitable. In a world that so severely restricted a woman's speech and actions, they developed a complex and subtle system of nonverbal communication. Accessories became their voice. The most famous of these was the language of the fan. While not a formalized, universal code, a woman could convey a great deal with a simple gesture. Snapping a fan shut could signal irritation or dismissal. Pressing a closed fan to her lips was a request for a secret meeting or a sign to be silent. Central to this entire system was the figure of the chaperone. This was typically an older, unmarried female relative or a hired companion whose sole job was to accompany a young, unmarried lady everywhere she went in public. The chaperone was the physical embodiment of a woman's reputation. Her presence was non-negotiable. She sat in on morning calls, accompanied her charge on walks and carriage rides, and sat along the wall at balls, keeping a vigilant eye. The courtship process itself was a slow, formal, and highly public affair. It began with the introduction, followed perhaps by the 2 permitted dances at a ball. If a gentleman's interest was piqued, he might then make a morning call. This was a formal visit to the lady's home. Usually between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. he would stay for no more than 20 minutes, and the conversation would be light, general, and conducted under the watchful eye of the chaperone. While our modern sensibilities focus on the nightmare for women, it's important to acknowledge that men of the aristocracy also faced significant pressures, albeit of a different kind. The heir to a title and an estate had a profound duty to his lineage. His primary obligation was to marry a respectable woman and produce a male heir to carry on the family name and inherit the property. This was not a personal choice but a dynastic requirement. A silk fan held just so, not for the heat of the ballroom but as a secret language. A flutter, a snap, a gentle fold, each a coded message in a world that rarely let women speak freely. For a woman, the choice of a husband was severely limited by class and wealth. Marrying down was social suicide. A lady from a titled family could not, under any circumstances, consider a man from the merchant class, no matter how wealthy he might be. It would mean being ostracized by her own circle. What happened to the women who failed in this high-stakes game? The consequences were stark and lifelong. A woman who went through several seasons without receiving a suitable offer of marriage was deemed a spinster. The term itself, originally referring to a woman who spins thread, became a label of failure and pity. She would be forced to live as a dependent in the home of a relative, often her parents or a more fortunate married sibling. The culmination of a successful courtship was the proposal of marriage. However, this romantic climax was often anything but. In most cases, especially in the upper echelons of society, the proposal was a formality. The real decision had already been made by the families. Once a gentleman had decided to pursue a lady in earnest, he would first approach her father or male guardian. He would make a formal declaration of his intentions and present his financial situation for inspection. The concept of an accomplished woman was central to her education and her presentation on the marriage market. As famously satirized by Jane Austen through the character of Caroline Bingley, a truly accomplished woman was expected to have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and modern languages. She was also expected to have a something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address, and expressions. However, there was a fine line to walk. The double standard between the sexes was not just a social convention. It was the bedrock of the entire system. A man's life before marriage could be filled with mistresses, gambling, and other vices. While excessive behavior might be frowned upon, a certain amount of sowing his wild oats was often seen as a normal part of a young nobleman's life. It did little to harm his marriage prospects, and in some circles, might even enhance his reputation as a man of the world. Driving and riding in Hyde Park was a key ritual of the London season. Every afternoon between the hours of 4 and 6, the fashionable world would descend upon the park to see and be seen. For a young woman, this was another public stage. It was an opportunity to display her elegance, her fine clothing, and her horsemanship if she was riding. It was also a prime location for controlled public interactions. The journey from introduction to marriage was governed by a strict etiquette of names and forms of address. Upon first being introduced, and for a long time afterward, a couple would refer to each other only by their formal titles, Mr. Darcy and Miss Bennet. To use a person's first name, or Christian name, was an act of great intimacy reserved for family and very close friends. The country house party offered a different, and sometimes more effective, environment for matchmaking than the London ballroom. These were gatherings lasting several days or even weeks, where a host would invite a curated group of guests to their country estate. For a suitor, it was an invaluable opportunity. In London, he might only see a lady for a few minutes at a ball or during a formal call. At a country house party, he could observe her for an extended period. While we often associate this era with the grand aristocracy, it's crucial to understand that these brutal rules trickled down through the social classes. The daughters of the gentry, the clergy, and the growing professional class all faced similar pressures, albeit on a smaller scale. A country lawyer's daughter might not be presented at Almack's, but she would attend the local assembly balls in towns like Meryton, as depicted in Pride and Prejudice. Her season would be the local social calendar. The role of the mother in this process cannot be overstated. Figures like Mrs. Bennet from Pride and Prejudice, though a caricature, represent a genuine social phenomenon. A mother's own standing in society was often directly linked to the success of her daughters. A good match for her child would reflect well on her, cementing her own social position. Consequently, many mothers became master strategists and relentless drill sergeants. The chaperone, a constant shadow at a young woman's side. She was a guardian, a jailer, the ever-watchful eye of society, ensuring that every rule of propriety was meticulously, painfully observed. Let's consider the waltz. Today, it seems the epitome of old-fashioned formal dancing. But in the Regency era, it was a scandalous sensation. Before the waltz, most popular dances, like the cotillion or the country dance, were performed in groups, with partners touching only hands. The waltz was different. It involved a man placing his hand on a woman's waist and holding her in a close embrace as they spun around the floor. The exchange of letters was a crucial component of any serious courtship, but it was governed by its own strict set of rules. A gentleman would not write to a young lady directly. Instead, he would write to her father, formally requesting permission to correspond with his daughter. If permission was granted, the letters would still be subject to family censorship. What about love? In this world of financial transactions and social strategy, did genuine love even stand a chance? The answer is complex. For the majority, the primary goal was a suitable match, and love was considered a happy but non-essential bonus. The expectation was that affection and companionship would grow over time within a stable, well-ordered marriage. However, human emotion is not so easily suppressed. We must also consider the legal status of women, which underpinned this entire social structure. Under the common law principle of coverture, a married woman had virtually no legal existence separate from her husband. Upon marriage, her property, her earnings, and her very identity were covered by his. She could not sign contracts, sue or be sued, or own property in her own name. The coming out of a debutante was the official start of her journey on the marriage market. This was a formal presentation to society, signaling that she was now of marriageable age. For the highest echelons of the aristocracy, this meant being presented at court to the monarch. The young woman, dressed in a specific and often cumbersome court dress, would be escorted by a married female relative who had already been presented. She would perform a deep, choreographed curtsy to the king or queen. The fashion of the Regency era, with its high-waisted, pseudo-classical gowns, looks light and liberating compared to the corsets and bustles of the Victorian era that followed. However, this simplicity was deceptive. The fine muslin and silk fabrics were often thin and revealing, especially when dampened to create a clinging, statuesque effect, a practice that was rumored to lead to illness. More importantly, the fashion was designed to present the female form as an idealized object. Gossip was the lifeblood of Regency society. It functioned as a social currency, an information network, and a brutal weapon. In a world where reputation was everything, gossip could make or break a person. It was spread in whispers at balls, in letters between friends, and during morning calls. It served as a means of social policing, reinforcing the era's strict moral codes by publicizing the transgressions of those who dared to defy them. The period was defined by a stark contrast between public propriety and private vice. While society demanded an almost impossibly high standard of female virtue and public decorum, the private lives of many in the aristocracy were rife with scandal. The Prince Regent himself, the future King George IV, was famous for his mistresses, his extravagance, and his secret, illegal marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. Adultery, gambling, and heavy drinking were common among the elite. Let us explore the concept of the second son. Under the system of primogeniture, the vast majority of a family's wealth and all of its landed property passed to the eldest son. This left younger sons in a precarious position. They would receive a good education and had the advantage of a prestigious family name, but they had no land and very little independent income. They had to make their own way in the world. The acceptable professions were limited: the church, the army, the navy, or the law. The city of Bath played a unique role in the social landscape. While London was the premier stage for the young and high-ranking, Bath was the resort of choice for a wider range of the gentry. It was a place where people went to take the waters for their health, but it also had a thriving social scene of its own, with its own pump room, assembly rooms, and circulating libraries. Bath became a secondary marriage market, often for those who were older, widowed, or of a slightly lower social standing. To be caught alone with a man, even for a moment, was to court disaster. The briefest, most innocent of encounters could ignite a scandal that would consume a reputation in an instant. The idea of a woman's education was a topic of intense debate during this period. Traditionalists believed that a woman's education should be limited to the accomplishments, music, drawing, and perhaps a little French, that would make her an agreeable wife. However, a growing movement, championed by thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft, argued for a more substantive education. They believed that women, as rational beings, deserved the same intellectual development as men. While marriage was the ultimate goal, the engagement period itself was a delicate and transitional phase. Once a proposal was accepted, the couple entered a new, more privileged state of interaction, but they were still not free from scrutiny. They were now allowed to be seen together more frequently in public, to dance more than 2 sets, and to use each other's first names. The gentlemen could now offer personal gifts. However, they were still never to be left completely alone. Let's consider the physical spaces where this drama unfolded. The Regency ballroom was designed for surveillance. It was typically a large, brightly lit room, often with raised areas or balconies where chaperones and observers could sit and watch the proceedings below. The open floor plan meant there were few places to hide or have a private conversation. Similarly, the London drawing room, where morning calls took place, was a formal, public space within the home. The role of literature, particularly the novel, was immensely important in shaping and reflecting these social rules. The rise of the circulating library made novels accessible to a wide female readership. These books, often written by women like Jane Austen, Fanny Burney, and Maria Edgeworth, served as both entertainment and instruction. They provided a detailed map of the social landscape, illustrating the potential pitfalls and rewards of the marriage market. The duel, though technically illegal by this period, still lingered as a dark shadow over male social interaction. A gentleman's honor was a fragile and paramount concern. An insult, a slight to a female relative, or an accusation of cheating at cards could all lead to a challenge. If a man was seen to be trifling with a lady's affections, paying her marked attention without following through with a proposal, he could find himself facing a challenge from her brother or father. The end of the season in July marked a crucial turning point. For a young woman who had secured a proposal, it was a moment of triumph and relief. Her family could retreat to their country estate to plan the wedding, her future secure. But for the woman who had not, it was a time of deep anxiety and disappointment. The social world would stop, the family would leave London, and she would be left to face the questions and the pity of her friends and neighbors. She had failed her first campaign. Let's delve deeper into the legalities of the marriage settlement, as this was the true foundation of a woman's future. A skillfully negotiated settlement could provide a woman with a degree of financial independence and protection. Lawyers could structure a trust that would keep the wife's dowry separate from her husband's assets, protecting it from his debts or mismanagement. This trust would be managed by trustees, often her brother or uncle. The concept of family lineage was an obsession for the aristocracy and gentry. A good marriage was not just about the two individuals involved, it was about the merging of two bloodlines. Families would scrutinize a potential suitor's or bride's ancestry with the same care they might apply to the breeding of a racehorse. They were looking for good blood, a long and distinguished family history, free from scandal or inappropriate connections. The theater and the opera were key venues in the social life of the ton, but they were not simply places for entertainment. A family's social standing was on display through the location and size of their private box. The theater was another place to see and be seen. During the intervals, people would visit each other's boxes, exchanging gossip and pleasantries. It was a prime opportunity for a gentleman to pay a brief, public call on a lady and her family. How did women support each other in this high-pressure environment? While there was undoubtedly intense rivalry, there were also strong bonds of female friendship and kinship. Sisters, cousins, and close friends provided a vital support network. They could offer advice, share information, and provide emotional comfort away from the prying eyes of society. A trusted friend could help a young woman decode a suitor's intentions or offer a sympathetic ear after a disappointing evening. A gentleman's fortune was a matter of public record, his lands and income discussed openly. A lady's dowry was her weapon, the number that would determine the quality of the life she could hope to lead. The role of the servants in this drama is often overlooked, but they were the invisible witnesses to everything. Ladies' maids, footmen, and butlers saw and heard far more than they ever let on. A lady's maid would know her mistress's true feelings, helping her dress for a ball she dreaded or comforting her after a rejection. A footman would know which gentleman called most frequently and how long he stayed. The presentation of gifts was a highly regulated aspect of courtship. Before a formal engagement, a gentleman was severely restricted in what he could give a lady. A bouquet of flowers, a sheet of music, or a book were generally considered acceptable. A gift of jewelry or clothing, however, was seen as highly improper. Such a personal and expensive gift implied a degree of intimacy and obligation that was not yet appropriate. Grand tour, a traditional trip through Europe undertaken by young aristocratic men, also played a role in the marriage market. A man who had completed his grand tour was considered more worldly, sophisticated, and polished. He had been exposed to the art, culture, and languages of the continent, making him a more accomplished and desirable husband. However, the tour also had a reputation for being a period of moral license, where young men could indulge in behaviors they never could at home. The concept of romantic elopement, most famously associated with Gretna Green in Scotland, stands as a dramatic act of rebellion against this entire system. Scotland had different marriage laws, allowing for quick and legally binding ceremonies without parental consent. For a couple facing insurmountable family opposition, perhaps due to a lack of fortune or a class disparity, fleeing to Gretna Green was a desperate, last-ditch option. However, it was a move fraught with peril. Let's examine the specific phrasings used during a courtship, as the language itself was a carefully coded tool. A man would not say, "I love you." He would speak of his esteem, his admiration, or his sincere regard. The language was intentionally formal and indirect. To declare his intentions, he would speak to the father of his hope to form an alliance between the two families. Even a rejection had its own polite script. The weather, a common topic of British conversation, took on a strategic importance in the Regency dating world. A rainy day could be a disaster, forcing the cancellation of a planned outing to the park or a garden party, thereby eliminating a precious opportunity for a supervised public meeting. On the other hand, a sudden downpour during a country walk could be a manufactured opportunity. Health, both real and feigned, was another tool in a woman's limited arsenal. The image of the delicate, fragile lady prone to fainting spells or nervous complaints is a common trope of the era. While some of these ailments were undoubtedly real in a world that demanded constant public performance, feigning illness could be a strategic retreat. A sudden headache could be the perfect excuse to withdraw from a tedious conversation or avoid a dance with an undesirable partner. The wedding itself was the grand finale of a successful courtship campaign. Unlike modern weddings, the focus was less on the couple's personal tastes and more on the public display of the family's status and wealth. The ceremony was typically a small, private affair held in the parish church or even the bride's drawing room, attended only by close family. The real celebration was the wedding breakfast that followed. This was a lavish meal for a wider circle of friends and relations. Let us not forget the men who did not fit the mold of the wealthy, landed aristocrat. What about the poets, the artists, the intellectuals? These men often existed on the fringes of the fashionable world. They might be invited to parties as interesting curiosities, to add a touch of intellectual sparkle to an evening. However, they were almost never considered serious marriage prospects for a woman of good family. They lacked the essential qualifications: wealth and stable social standing. The architecture of the Regency townhouse in areas like Bath or London's Belgravia was itself a reflection of these social divisions. The ground floor often contained the family's public reception rooms, the dining room, and the library or morning room. The first floor, known as the piano nobile, held the grandest room, the drawing room, where formal entertaining took place. The family's private bedrooms were on the floors above, while the servants were relegated to the attics and basements.